Ryan Jones is the Anne Swindells Chair and Department Head of History and affiliated faculty in Asian Studies and Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Oregon. His research interests include Russia, the Pacific, and the global environment. Ryan is the author of Empire of Extinction, Russians and the Strange Beasts of the Sea, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2014, as well as Red Leviathan, the Soviet Union and the Secret Destruction of the World's Whales, which came out with University of Chicago Press in 2022. And that second book was shortlisted for the Pushkin House Book Prize and won the 2023 Best Book in International Maritime History from the American Society for Ocean History. As a 2024-25 Oregon Humanities Center Faculty Research Fellow, Ryan has been working on a project titled Sperm Whales and Polynesians, the Diasporic Worlds of Hawaii Whaler John Bull and His Prey. And he shares his work in progress with us today. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. Of course, let me express my thanks, too, for the Oregon Humanities Center, especially at this time, which is difficult for the humanities. In particular, the support that you've given me and many others in this room is just, it's so valuable and so appreciated. I've really been enjoying this quarter in particular, getting to work in a serious way on a current book project. So this is part of a larger book project. It is meant to be a large history of humans and whales. It's under contract with Norton Press, so it's pitched for a more general audience. If anyone can help me with the title, I'd appreciate it. I want to call it Ceta History to riff off Hayden White's Meta History,
right.
And I can already imagine Norton's response to this.
Like,
no way, absolutely no way.
Marketing requested.
Yeah, so there's this larger history which tries to tell in particular the history of globalization as refracted through the relationship between humans and whales. Kind of reframing some of these well-known but still really important processes of colonialism, capitalism, civil society, etc. With one of the goals is to tell it in quite a different way. In one sense, to look at the real human history of globalization, those people who experienced it on a very personal level, like John Bull, who I'll be talking about today. And on the other hand, on a non-human level, on a cetacean level, what role, how does new knowledge, especially scientific knowledge, about whales, which fueled so many of the important stories of globalization, developments of science, international linkages, etc., capitalism, colonialism. How understanding we have the tools to understand whale lives in really remarkable new ways. I'm going to share some of them with you today. And how does that relationship, the human relationship with the much more complex cetacean societies, how does that change the way we think about this history? So, I'm sharing with you one chapter today. This is going to be chapter 4, probably Societies at Sea. And I want to I'll get you into this project through the lens of this specific man. The chapter revolves around him. But I also want to sort of tell you a little bit about the archival journey that brought me to John Bull, because it's been really fun and really interesting. John Bull, the Sperm Whales and Polynesians, the Diasporic Worlds of Hawaiian Whaler John Bull and His Prey. This chapter centers on the growth of open ocean pelagic whaling that, if any of you are familiar with it, you probably associate it with Moby Dick, the works of Herman Melville, who is writing at almost exactly the same time period that I'm going to be talking about today. And this is a period that's usually discussed as the rise of American power in the Pacific, commercial and then political power, leading ultimately, by the way, to the colonization of Bull's homeland, Hawaii. The best title here, the classic book, is Yankees in Paradise. Americans just sort of discovering islands, killing whales, and all that's true, of course. In 1849, for example, there were about 1,000 whale ships on the Pacific Ocean. 729 of them were American. They were killing between 5,000 to 6,000, mostly sperm whales. Here you see a pod of sperm whales during that time. And so there's a lot of truth, of course, but this era was much more complex, though, than just American commercial and political dominance. And one of the most interesting developments was that as this industry began to taper off, and already it had reached its peak in the late 1840s, late 1850s, though it was still important until the 1910s, Americans were largely replaced by others. By Portuguese, Azorians by the most part, to a lesser but still really important degree by Polynesians and other people from the island Pacific. Even at the highest level, we know the least about their lives. The only actors in this story that we know less about is sperm whale lives. Look, I'm going to try to bring both of their lives into this and just talk about ways that this changes our understanding of this period. So I came across John Bull when I was actually writing the previous chapter. It was chapter 3, and that discussed the really devastating impact that shore whaling had around the Pacific on indigenous communities. Nowhere more so than on the island of Tasmania. Tasmania is south of Australia. It was inhabited by people called Aboriginal Tasmanians. Whalers came in there starting in 1800 and just quickly and exhaustively wiped out the right whales that inhabited the sort of shallow waters of this island. And in the process, they also completed one of the most thorough genocides in human history. That is, they killed nearly every single Aboriginal Tasmanian. The most famous of these, maybe the most famous two Aboriginal Tasmanians are pictured here. The one man is a guy by the name of William Lanny. He's seated next to his wife, maybe it's a somewhat controversial woman named Truganini, who features in the Midnight Oil song, if you're a Midnight Oil fan at all. And they became famous because they were known as the last of the Tasmanians, the last 4 people here, and then the last 2 to survive. Now, this has been contested by historians. Certainly there is cultural and even genetic survival of Aboriginal Tasmanians, but most of them were killed, and I argue in the chapter, in large part because they never found a place in the whaling industry because it was so quick and so destructive. Those who did the best were people like William Lanny, and you see him in the other picture here, the trio, dressed in his whaling garb. And that's what he became famous for, that he had not just been the last Aboriginal Tasmanian, but also a really proficient whaler. The most well-known in Australia, at least, and the sort of the most horrible part of Lanny's story was his death. He died in 1869. He came home from a whaling voyage sick, and then he drank for 3 days straight, and he died. And the funeral was big news. It was in all the papers in Tasmania for the reason that it was the last one, but also because after he died, the most important member of Tasmanian society, a man named William Crowther, who founded the whaling archive there, dug his body up, chopped his head off, and sent it to London to be exhibited as a specimen of the last Aboriginal Tasmanian, the sort of ultimate desecration, of these people. So, very well-known story in Australia. What I found very interesting was at Lanny's funeral, he had 8 pallbearers. 4 of them were so-called white lads who had been his shipmates, and the other 4 were, to use the Australian term of the time, they were colored people. There was an African American. There was another Aboriginal, this guy from Kangaroo Island, which is in South Australia, and there was a Hawaiian. I guess there were 3. So-called colored, and then the ship captain, Charles Bailey, who he'd crewed with on his last voyage. John Bull thought, okay, who is this guy, John Bull? What's his connection? What story can we tell? Like, here's a guy, Lanny, who lost everything, his whole family, all of his people, and yet, when he died, he had formed some kind of community. that was very different than the one that he had been born into, but nonetheless was clearly an important kind of community. I'm going to see if I can figure out who these people are. And it turned out, as I was in the archives in Tasmania, I found this picture of John Bull. I thought, oh, okay, so he was actually not just a pallbearer of William Lanny, but fairly well known in his own right. And that turned out to be the case. I ended up finding traces of John Bull in many different parts of the world, especially in Hawaii. So this is a picture of Honolulu Harbor in 1854. John Bull will move to Bull now. Bull was born in 1828, so he was, 26, at this time. And I show you this picture for a couple of reasons. One is Perkins was an American, probably surgeon, we don't know much about him, but he sailed into Honolulu Harbor at this time, drew this picture, and he said, look, it was incredible. Honolulu Harbor was so packed full of whaling ships that we could barely find a berth. And this was something pretty new in Hawaiian history, this massive explosion of shipping that had been going on really since the 1820s, but was reaching a peak in the 1850s, especially with whalers. And the other reason I show you is Perkins plays actually a really important role in John Bull's story. So why was Hawaii becoming such an important place in the growing Pacific whaling trade? Well, it was because of this move mostly to pelagic or offshore whaling. This is a map compiled from later statistics. I don't know how well you can see it, but showing the major places that sperm whales were pursued in the 19th century. Sperm whales are a species of toothed whale, which mostly pursues benthic or deep ocean prey, especially cephalopods, squids of different kinds. And they're usually not found close to shore. They're usually found in places like, this is a place that was the so-called offshore ground, or on the line ground near the Galapagos, the Japan ground, which was the most important probably for Hawaii's purposes. Deep water, far from all land. So this, for the very first time, whaling became truly global. In other words, was really pursuing the places where very few humans had ever really lingered for any reason before. Very few humans had really sailed over many of these places. And it was very much tied to this move towards sperm whales as the center of the industry, as the other slower nearshore species had been decimated. And Hawaii, as you can see, has very few sperm whale catches nearby. Hawaii's importance was its centrality, was a place where you could dock, restock for provisions en route. Say you wanted to hunt in Japan, the Japan grounds during the northern hemisphere summer, and then down here in the southern hemisphere summer. Hawaii was the logical and really the only transit point that made a lot of sense for these people. So what for these whalers? So what about this animal? Well, here's one of the early depictions of a sperm whale leaping out of the water. Frederick Bennett, who wrote the natural history which really inspired Moby Dick, said, one of the inspirations anyway, and one of the sources that Melville used, the sperm whale head, and the sperm whale head, as I'm going to argue, is the key to the sperm whale here. I mean, its massive forehead, which is 1/3 the size of its body, is what sets it off from any other kind of whale. It also contains the most valuable thing from a human perspective, the spermaceti, waxy liquid in there. The sperm whale head, according to Bennett, was obviously intended to render this part of the animal particularly buoyant, to ensure its correct position in swimming, to facilitate the elevation of the spiracle above the surface of the sea. It's hard not to laugh. This is a whale that spends much of its time in the deepest depths of the ocean. You think about if it had a balloon on the top of its head that it was swimming against the whole time, it would be incredibly impractical. So perhaps it's not that obvious. In fact, Bennett was totally wrong, but gives you a sense of the knowledge of sperm whales at the time. The sperm whale head is actually almost entirely, we think now, engineered for sound production. I probably don't have time to go into the physiology of this, nor do I perhaps understand it as fully as I should, but the sperm whale produces sounds out of the so-called monkey lips here, and it bounces them off the back of the head near the brain, by the way, the largest brain in the world, and refracts them through that spermaceti, which is an undulating organ, which allows two things, Well, a couple of things. It allows it to shape the sound in really sophisticated ways. It has a very complex chamber. It allows them to make the loudest sound on planet Earth that we're aware of, at least 250 decibels. Was it roughly twice a jet engine on takeoff? And I was going to say one more thing. Well, we'll leave it at 2 for now. Those are the most important things. What this means is sperm whales are exceptionally adapted to the dark underwater worlds which they inhabit and hunt. They're smart, warm-blooded animals which swim to great depths and then use their sound production as sonar. This is something that we really only began to understand in the 1970s, but it's been unraveled pretty well. Use it as sonar, but also as communication. This is sort of the head does everything for the sperm whale. It has allowed them to produce in huge numbers around the world. Okay, as one of the kind of key breakthroughs in understanding sperm whale phonation came in the 1980s, came from a man who's really important in this story, a biologist who now works at Dalhousie University named Hal Whitehead. Really aptly named. I've met him at a conference where he has a huge bushel of white hair that he looks like a mad scientist. And he's produced remarkable research around sperm whale clicks. He and a couple of his co-researchers spent years sailing through, especially the Galapagos, this is where most of their research took place, recording and then transcribing different sperm whale clicks. And what they noticed, Hal tells a really great story about looking through all this data and then having this epiphany, suddenly rushing upstairs to talk to his collaborator, Luke Rendell, saying, "We found it." What they found was that sperm whale clicks were neither individual nor random. What they were is highly patterned, stereotyped, and they varied widely around the Pacific Ocean, but according to some very interesting predictable variations. That is, sperm whales which traveled together almost always made the same, what they call a coda. So a sperm whale usually will send out bursts of sonar. It's scanning its surroundings, and then just at the end of that burst, they'll produce a coda, like in music, right? Which is highly, as I said, highly stereotyped. It could be a long pulse of a bzz, bzz. Well, probably better I just let you listen to it. It's important to know what a sperm whale sounds like for this talk. Here we go. I'll let the BBC handle this part.
These ocean giants, a family of grandmothers, mothers and daughters, are sleeping. Female sperm whales live in tight-knit groups and do everything together, hunt, care for their young and socialise. However, their lives remain largely a mystery to us. Sperm whales are not easy to study, as they spend much of their time foraging in the depths of the midnight zone, holding their breath for an incredible 2 hours. No one really knows what goes on down there in the darkness. In an attempt to understand these elusive creatures, scientists have spent almost 20 years eavesdropping on around 400 sperm whales that live in the eastern Caribbean. Hear this sperm whale as she searches the darkness. She makes a clicking sound to echolocate her prey, listening as the sound waves reflect back to her after hitting an object.
That's the sonar pulse.
Now she buzzes, a burst of rapid clicks just before going in for the kill.
That's the coda.
The whales are in constant communication with one another. Now we can hear 2 whales from the same group as they take turns to repeat the identity clicks of their clan. The researchers found subtle variations too in the delivery of the sequences of clicks, also known as codas. Listen to how this sperm whale varies the speed of the coda while keeping the rhythm the same. Much like if we were to say, what or what?
Okay, well, this part is somewhat speculative, to be honest with you. I've listened to a lot of presentations about sperm whale language, and many people, such as Hal himself, really disagrees with the idea that this is language in the way that we understand it, at least. What they do agree on, right, is that the closest parallel to different sperm whale coda groups may be ethno-linguistic groups of humans. The idea being that coda clicks correspond to a number of things, different sort of ecological strategies. One group, which has the same quota, forages for deep sea squid. Another with a different quota, mostly is searching for shallower water prey, things like that. So there is a cultural differences associated with linguistic differences. And another interesting thing, and this is research just came out last year, actually from a graduate student at Oregon State University that I interviewed for this, is that these cliques, these coda groupings, actually extend across the Pacific. So here's one map of basically ethno-linguistic diversity around the Pacific. And what people have found, what researchers have found, is that there are certain sperm whale clans which actually exist as far away as Japan to Kiribati, for example, down to southern Chile. That's the short clan. They all have the same clique. We don't know the history behind this. We don't know. They must have had some kind of cultural communication to have maintained this similarity. And what's clear is, like humans too, when sperm whales with different codas come together, they click like crazy. They make tons and tons of noise, as if to say, like, this is me, you're you, stay away, right? They're very xenophobic, sperm whales. It was one of the conclusions that we can draw. Okay, so that's the introduction to the sperm whales. I just wanted to consider an interesting parallel with Polynesia. Polynesians, this is a name that Western explorers gave to those who inhabited the many islands of the Pacific. And of course, in one sense, it's an artifact of Western colonialism. In another sense, though, they were describing something which was meaningful. And that is that people in the Pacific had migrated to places like Hawaii. Here you see a map of the general history, as far as we understand it, of migration. Had migrated from a common source, especially around Tahiti and the Marquesas and Tuamotu, and this is the most important area for this talk. And as a result of this shared history of migration, they had a shared language. For example, a language in Hawaii called Hawaiian. The name in Hawaii for man, by the way, is Kanaka Meoli. The name for man in Tahiti is Meohi. The name for man in New Zealand is Maori. Obviously very similar. They all mean genuine, or like the real. Kanaka is man. Meoli is like the real person. So there's a shared linguistic history. Now, around the year 1000, voyaging connections between these different parts of Polynesia seem to have been lost. It's a story that archaeologists are still trying to recover. But what was certainly not lost was a memory, right? Increasingly mythologized, but a memory of these long-distance connections and ancestral connections, often referred to as through an ancestral homeland, which was called Kahiki. It's a long, complicated story, but just to say that there was a sense in places like Hawaii and other places that they belonged to a much larger community of humans with shared ethnic, linguistic, and cultural ties. All right, so that brings us back to Hawaii. Here's Perkins' view of the whaling port of Lahaina, which I show you for a couple of reasons. This was the second most important whaling port in Hawaii, as the island of Maui, burned down last year. But what you see here is a pretty good representation of what was taking place in Hawaii, which was that much of the land in Hawaii was being repurposed. Here you see for Western-style agriculture, you see the cow, to provision foreign whalers in the 1850s. And what this meant for common people, the so-called Makainana in Hawaii, was mixed at best. I show you the king of Hawaii at the time. This is Kamehameha III, grandson. I think his grandson, the third Kamehameha, let's just say. And he oversaw one of the most important transitions in Hawaiian history. This was the privatization of the kingdom's land. Not surprisingly, much to the benefit of wealthy, powerful people like the Kamehamehas and those who served them. Not always, this is also controversial in Hawaiian history, but not always, it's fair to say, to the benefit of common laborers. And many many people have seen one of the associated processes of the expansion or the importance of Hawaii to the whaling industry was a proletarianization of Hawaiian workers. Greg Rosenthal wrote about this in his book Beyond Hawaii. And this rendered many Hawaiians landless, but at the same time offered them certain opportunities. And one of the best opportunities was to join a whaling ship. So I looked through the records in Hawaii, the port records, to see if I could figure out where John Bull came from and where he went. I have no idea where he came from still. Somewhere in Hawaii, certainly. Of course, the name John Bull makes it very difficult to find him. John Bull was a sort of slang term for England at the time. And so when you do newspaper searches, like, oh wow, 6,000 hits! None of them are the John Bull that I need. A few of them were, though, actually. And so I did find John Bull in the port records. Here he is. Right here, he shipped with the ship Julian. I don't know for sure if this was the same John Bull. 1849, he would have been 21 at the time, but it gives you a sense of how Hawaiians entered the record at the time. Here he is with Jack Maui, Jim Crow, Hong Toi. Yeah, not particularly subtle, right? In other words, these were names that were applied to the proletariat workers of the whaling ships based on their racial identity, obviously. And John Bull was, Hawaiian, given maybe he had some association with Great Britain somehow. I'm not entirely sure. There were a lot of John Bulls out there. If you look through the whaling records, there were at least 2 Cook Islanders. Cook Island's very not far from Tahiti, by the way. Will play a role in this story too. There were several Tahitians named John Bull, and then at least this one Hawaiian. There may have been more. So he possibly shipped with the Julian in 1849. If he did, he had several Hawaiian shipmates. There was another John Bull. This is one that Greg Rosenthal discusses in his book, who shipped with the American whale ship, the Hannibal, from 1850 to 1852. The Hannibal sailed all around the world, was especially spent a long time up in the Arctic, places that Hawaiians didn't particularly like to go, but often ended up. And if this was this John Bull, which I think it likely was, given the timing, he had a horrific experience. In some ways, an experience which we might take as typical at some points in this history. So his captain was a man by the name of Sluman Gray, and the Hannibal should have been called the Hannibal Lecter because it was a ship of torture, and torture meted out in particular to Hawaiians on board. There's reports whoever kept the ship's log was quite sympathetic to these Hawaiians. He talked about a man named John Bull being whipped for 2 hours straight. A couple months later near Indonesia, he was whipped again so that he had furrows in his skin. When he complained, Sluman Gray shouted at him, "Good enough for you, you damn," racial epithet. And Sluman Gray got sick. All the Hawaiians came on board and they danced a dance. They were so happy. And then he recovered and he beat them some more. And the ship's logkeeper was, I'll just quote it to you, said, "Is there no law, no justice to redress his wrongs, or must he," talking about John Bull, "receive the most brutal treatment from a tyrannical shipmaster? And because he is ignorant of the language and laws of the country, can have no redress." Well, I guess in some sense Bull did get his revenge, though later. This is Sluman Gray's grave. He became famous because he died on board his ship in 1861, so 9 years later. And his ship was then captured by a Confederate raider. Maybe I may have the year wrong, but it's right around then. And they decided instead of burying Sluman Gray, they would pickle his body and bring him home. So he spent about 2 years pickled in a barrel before he ended up in this grave in Connecticut. So anyway, strange things happened to people's bodies in the 19th century, obviously. Okay, so maybe that was a horror. So maybe this John Bull may have experienced the absolute degradation kind of American capitalism. But his story took an interesting turn in 1852, and this is the connection with Edward Perkins. I was shocked to find his name, and this is definitely the John Bull, that I'm dealing with. And the ship's log of the Eliza Mary. The Eliza Mary was actually a schooner which was sailing from California to Tahiti, carrying oranges. Would carry oranges from Tahiti back to these places. Stopped in Hawaii, and it picked up a couple of people. One was Perkins, right here. This is Perkins, under the name Thomas Perkins. He wrote this book right here, Namotu, which interestingly he borrows the Polynesian word for islands, Namotu. And John Bull. Where's John? Here he is. They sailed on the same ship, and Perkins wrote an account of his voyage. So John Bull is actually, although he's never mentioned by name, he's on this same trip that Perkins describes. I couldn't believe he actually entered the literature like this. By the way, he was there with 24 Hervey Islanders. These are Cook Islanders. Some of them were for Aitutaki. A number of different Hawaiians. People given these bizarre names: Pope Yarn, Spun Yarn, Tom Paine, Jack Jr., Eel, Black, just, I guess, getting straight to the point. Another way of reading the ship's log, though, and another way that this helped me read Perkins' account, it's a strange little book, by the way, just mostly consumed with food wherever Perkins goes. Another way of reading this, though, is that this was actually an almost entirely Polynesian experience and Polynesian crew. And I'll tell you how I think I started to reread this book. So Perkins, they sail, and the contrary winds keep them from going to Tahiti, the island of Tahiti, where they're trying to get to. They end up in Bora Bora instead of in Raiatea, which then were independent. France had just conquered Tahiti, just colonized it, but there were still some independent Tahitian islands. And when Perkins describing his voyage, he just talks about making connections with all the Europeans on the island. Right? There's a Frenchman there, there's a Brit, there's an American, and he goes to all of them to sort of establish a community here, as well as to look for roast beef, because he's like, I can't just eat breadfruit anymore. The interesting thing, though, is that he keeps coming across Hawaiians everywhere he goes, and the Hawaiians are the real facilitators, actually, of their successful stay, because they can translate between the English and the Tahitian. The other key member, by the way, is this one of the Cook Islanders, a guy by the name of Bob, who'd spent 7 years whaling, was trying to get back to the Cook Islands, was now stuck in Tahiti. He could speak English, Tahitian, Cook Island, Maori, and Hawaiian, and was just basically, by the way, all the Hawaiians he meet are named John for some reason. So it's even more confusing, but one imagine John Bull's experience here. How did he experience this? This was a reconnection with people that he'd heard about, right, growing up, but now was in intimate contact with. Yes, this may have been organized by American capitalists, but it was an almost entirely Polynesian experience, and it was those connections facilitated by linguistic and cultural, and by the way, dietary understandings. He was happy to eat coconuts and breadfruit. He was not as desperate for pork as everyone else, seemingly, which helped me to rethink of this as a kind of going along with Keilani Cook, who wrote a great book on these connections, as a return to Kahiki. Increasing connections between Polynesian peoples allowed them to think of the Pacific Ocean as a broader pan-oceanic lahui, or nation. And from there, he did make it to Australia. He was in Australia probably by 1854, and in some ways certainly went outside this traditional diasporic Polynesian world, but not really entirely. I mean, first of all, he kept hunting sperm whales, and he joined whaling voyages as soon as he got to Tasmania. He kept hunting sperm whales off the coast of New Zealand, for example, where he met Maori from New Zealand, was also crewmates with them, also through other Pacific islands, and he played a very interesting role in the continuing story. I just found this story yesterday as I was looking back. In 1861, so he would have been in Tasmania for 7 years then, there was a kind of small scandal which erupted. And that was one of the whaling captains had brought, I think it was 7 natives of what we call Vanuatu today. This is the island of Tanna. And he had brought them back to Tasmania, and they performed a so-called corroboree they gave it this kind of indigenous Australian name, but it was basically like a luau dance for everyone in Tasmania. And there happened to be a missionary in town at the same time who was just like, you stole these people from the islands in Vanuatu. You kidnapped them. I heard, because he'd been a missionary there in Vanuatu, I heard that you had women on board for 3 days as well, and now you're exhibiting these Tawnees like wild animals in cages. And it was this uproar in Hobart. This is a picture of Hobart in 1866, which was the largest city in Tasmania, not very big, it must be said. It was an uproar, and they called the ship's captains to defend themselves. And the ship captain actually called John Bull and said, "You were there with me. What was?" And these are the only actually direct words I have from John Bull, because they quote him in the testimony that he gave in broken English, as I say. And he said, "We could have taken 40 on board. They were dying to come be with us. They were, and this goes to one of the controversial questions around the so-called blackbirding trade in the Pacific, whether, especially Melanesians, by the way, they didn't share linguistic similarities with John Bull. This is very different, distant connections, and whether they were forcibly conscripted as laborers or whether they joined voluntarily. Bull, at least, said, yeah, they wanted to come. There was no coercion whatsoever. The whaling industry is totally, people come because they want to. And actually, John Bull was the chief organizer of their this caged wild animal show, according to the missionaries. Although, I'm not entirely sure what that word is right there. But he was the chief something. And so he was very much involved in the kind of exotic display of the scrang, yeah, of course, the exotic display of other Pacific Islanders in the colony of Tasmania. Sorry, this is just a picture from the same time period, actually engraved on whalebone. But I'll finish Bull's story here in just a second. He really became famous in local society thanks to one incident in particular. Charles Bailey was the ship captain of the Runnymede. Here you see a picture of Bailey, and he was one of the more important whaling capitalists in Tasmania. And he was captaining the Runnymede off the coast of New Zealand when hunting for sperm whales in 1866, when he fell off into the ocean. By the way, one of the reasons Hawaiians, I should have mentioned this earlier, were so coveted in the trade was not just because they were desperately poor in Hawaii, but because they could swim. And this was a real rarity in the whaling trade. And so what happened? Well, Bull heard the splash, and he actually jumped in the water and swam out, grabbed Bailey, treaded water. According to the newspaper reports, he was cramping. By the way, the ocean is very cold off the coast of New Zealand, especially off the west coast there in the Tasman Sea. He was cramping up, just sinking below the waves when the ship's boat was able to come grab him and Bailey. Later years, this story became more and more exaggerated. They kept retelling it was that actually Bailey had been caught in the rope of the harpoon, dragged like 50 feet underwater. Bull had dived under and cut him away in the rope and saved him. The story grew with the retelling. There's an echo I'll tell you in a second. But anyway, Bailey rewarded him, first of all, with a fairly substantial prize of a gold watch that Bull was presumably able to sell, but then also by making him ship's captain. Bull became the first mate. Bull became actually, as far as I'm aware, the only Hawaiian to become the first mate on a ship. There was one Hawaiian ship captain. He was in Hawaii. It's a complicated story too. That's the highest position one could have. But Bull ascended to the second highest position. Something that really probably never could have happened in Hawaii itself, or was highly unlikely. in Hawaii. But bull was part of, by the 1870s, actually fully 1/3 of first mates were Polynesian in Tasmania. And there were many Azorians as well, for a number of reasons, partly because the industry was much less profitable by that time, which is something I'll return to in just one second. Anyway, the last evidence we have of bull is 1879, when a new steamship steams into Hobart and has a rope wrapped around its propeller. No one can disentangle it, so they call on Bull, who is by this time 51, and he dives 26 times, also very cold water in Hobart, by the way, and disentangles this rope. And everyone's like, no one has ever seen anyone dive like this. And it was only thanks to this plucky Maori that we were able to get this disentangled. I find this such a delicious irony here, right? Bull, in some ways, he's spent his whole life just being sort of miscategorized, given a name that indicates that he's British in some way. And then at the end of his life, he's called a Maori, an indigenous person from New Zealand, which he's not. Obviously, he's Hawaiian. But in some way, it expressed a truth. In other words, that Bull had really, through his experience of traveling the world, had reconnected with a kind of broader Polynesian identity. And he married an English woman, by the way, and when he died, he owned a house. And when he died in 1907, ended up being a very long-lived person. Okay, so let me finish with the sperm whales, though. Sperm whales had obviously been the reason that Bull had been able to ascend to this, relatively privileged position that he attained in this colonial world. Well, of course, by killing sperm whales, he was at the same time destroying the world that had made him, the source of wealth that had made him. And certainly it was mostly sperm whales was what Bull would have killed in his life. And already from the 1830s, people were asking themselves, aren't sperm whales going to disappear? Aren't we going to destroy them like we've destroyed other species of whales? Here's Herman Melville famously said, the moot point is whether Leviathan can long endure so wide a chase. So you want to know Melville's answer to that? Melville's like, it's fine. Whales are going to just find new places to go. They're going to find more and more distant reserves. They seem to be grouping up in different ways. He called them, sorry, you really can't read this. I'll just read it to you. Owing to the unwearied activity with which of late they've been hunted over all four oceans, the sperm whales, instead of almost invariably sailing in small detached companies, as in former times, are now frequently met with in extensive herds. That would almost seem as if numerous nations of them had sworn solemn league and covenant for mutual assistance and protection. In other words, we don't see many sperm whales anymore. Right? You go to the places where you used to see them, and they're not there. Why? It's because they've just gathered in larger groups, and so they're going to be more scattered. But it's not because there are fewer of them. Okay, one of the great things about whaling for historians is that whalers kept lots and lots of statistics, and scientists have dealt with these in really interesting ways. And here is one graph which shows that indeed sightings of sperm whales dropped dramatically from the 1840s. This is just the Japan grounds. I put it in for John. But the same phenomenon can be seen in other places as well. In other words, yes, whalers on any given day in a log were less and less likely to encounter a sperm whale, right, wherever they went. Obviously, they were going to places where they thought they would find them. Here's another graph, which is pretty interesting here. Here is the total kills of sperm whales, 1850s. Here's the total kill of sperm whales in the 1950s and 1960s, the era of modern industrial whaling, which I handle later in the book. This is way bigger, right? Okay, so this poses a conundrum for biologists. If there were this many sperm whales in the 1950s to be killed, and this is how many were killed in the 1850s, there clearly was not a significant threat to sperm whale populations. In fact, Melville possibly was kind of right, that they were not being seriously depleted, that something else was going on. It's controversial still. Biologists are working this out, but the most recent model, the one really interesting, came out just last year. Hal Whitehead, who's still working on this, reported, looking through the graphs, shows that sperm whales, when you sail into a herd of sperm whales that's never encountered humans before, it's a massacre, right? But within 2 years, your success drops by 58%. Now, I've already shown too many numbers for a humanities audience here, so I won't go through the graphs. He plots various models to explain this. For Whitehead, the most persuasive way of understanding is that social learning of defensive measures between social units is the best supported explanation for the rapid decline in strike rate, there's an extra R, following the first sperm whale sighting within a region. What does this mean? He says, okay, there are various ways we can explain this. Maybe all the stupid whales or incautious whales were killed immediately, right? And then it's the hard ones that are left. And for various reasons, the rapidity with which the change took place does not explain that. Maybe the whales themselves learn within this group, right? Quickly, you're targeted by whalers. You figure out, we got to do something different, right? This is not a killer whale. Basically, we need to do something different. You learn very quickly. That does not account for the rapidity either. The only explanation, for Whitehead at least, is that in some way, sperm whales were learning from others who had previously been targeted. For him, the explanation is precisely the clan structure of sperm whale society. In other words, you may have attacked a sperm whale in the Japan grounds of the short clan. It, as it migrates, as it connects with other members of the short clan, transmits in some way, no one's sure how they transmit this kind of knowledge. It's probably not encoded in syntax. It's maybe modeled. Some way, that clan, based on its diasporic connections, is much better prepared to handle the novel threat of Yankee whaling. So I'm going to end there, and just with a concluding thought, to note what I find kind of interesting connection here. Sperm whale clans, scattered around like the Pacific, like the Polynesian diaspora, was the whale's hidden source of resilience. The fact that there were these pre-existing cultural connections which could be called upon, in the case of humans, reactivated. In the case of sperm whales, we don't really know, but probably maintained, were the reasons that they were able to persist through a very violent wave of colonization in remarkably resilient ways. So it speaks to the power of not just the global connections that Americans were creating, but which were being recreated in this era of Pacific globalization. It also speaks, of course, to the powerful resilience of ethno-linguistic identity in an era of globalization, both for whales and for humans, for better and for worse.
That was fabulous. Will you entertain some questions?
Yeah, of course.
Back to the physiology.
Yeah.
Humans experiencing 250 decibels on a constant basis would be deaf after not very long.
Yeah.
How do the whales handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll be honest, I don't know exactly how they're insulated from that level of sonic power. What I do know is, or at least in the biological literature, there is a line of thought that says this is actually a powerful hunting tool for precisely those reasons. And this has been documented amongst certain species of dolphins, which basically render their prey so discombobulated through these powerful sonar bursts. Now, I think, so I'm just thinking back on everything I've read on this question, it does seem that sperm whales, and well, we know much more about dolphins because we keep dolphins in captivity. We don't keep sperm whales in captivity. Dolphins seem to, when they're in a tank with humans, to try to direct their powerful sonar pulses away. In other words, you're quite right that this can be damaging to other cetaceans, and I guess the dolphins understand probably for humans as well, because these sonar pulses are really strong. And yeah, a sperm whale pulse is much stronger still. So I don't have the precise answer for that, but my assumption is that they are careful, if we analogize from dolphins, that they are careful to direct sonar pulses away from each other. Yeah.
So I know you know this literature certainly way better than I do, the scientific studies, and how accepted is Whitehead and Rendell's conclusions in the scientific community?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's very recent. I'm very okay. I feel a little bad saying this, but he cites me in this paper from an earlier thing. In other words, historians and biologists can work together in really productive ways here. The only time I'll probably ever be cited by a biologist, but I was really excited to see that. Of course, he cites the same. This paper may offer some supporting evidence. So I was just talking to a colleague up at University of Washington who was like, yeah, this offers one possible explanation, right? He's like, I give this paper to my students. It came out last year, so I give this paper to my students, and there's mixed reaction to it. There's certainly, Whitehead is unusual amongst cetologists in that he's very interested in drawing parallels and thinking in terms of comparing and contrasting whale societies with human societies. That's one of his explicit models. Although he has millions of hours of experience one-on-one with whales, so he doesn't see them as like humans in the sea, but he does see them as socially organized, cultural mammals, which suggests some convergent evolution, at least between humans and whales.
Don't orcas have different methods? Like some organize to kill, some are more. They'll get a school of fish together. There's I've heard there's different almost philosophies.
Yeah, orcas.
Or different cultures among orcas.
Orcas are one of the sort of flagship species for the existence of culture in whales. In general, toothed whales are far more dependent on culture than are baleen whales for a variety of reasons, but in large part probably because their sonar capabilities, which almost certainly evolved as a way of understanding their environment, but have, as often happens in evolution, have a kind of unanticipated side effect, which is that it allows communication in ways that other whales just can't. They moan and bellow, basically, if you don't have that kind of powerful phonation. So killer whales are a great example, though, that the way that dialect goes hand in hand with ecotype. Yeah.
So that's really provocative, that the Whitehead thesis, and I was wondering if you could just elaborate on it a little bit more. I was thinking about orcas too, and I might be misremembering this, something I read in the Times months ago, but wasn't there like a pod of them in the Mediterranean that were flipping over boats?
Yeah.
And they were teaching each other to do it, and the kind of best conclusion that it was just teenagers screwing around. It's like the TikTok trend for orcas or something like that. I was intrigued by that. Like, how does that communication happen? And I'm wondering what Whitehead says about. You said there might be, that it would be linguistic communication is kind of tough to believe, but modeling. So how? I wonder if he expands on that at all. If you have thoughts, how would you model it if you weren't actually being attacked?
Well, the key. So killer whales play an important role here too, and this is one of the key insights that I'm taking, of course, from marine biologists and trying to work through this whole book, which is that every whale society has evolved not to get killed by killer whales. And this is, so this will come back to your point about killer whales, Osha, I promise. There are deeply embedded kind of cultural, maybe genetic forms of defense against killer whales. And for a long time, biologists doubted this because we just didn't see much killer whale predation. But interestingly, as large whale populations rebound after the commercial moratorium of 1987, we see killer whales killing whales everywhere. I just saw spectacular footage of killer whales killing an adult blue whale, which is horrific to watch, by the way, but indicative of what the oceans used to be like, probably, right? And there are two basic mechanisms to defend against a killer whale. One is flee, right, just as quickly as you can, and those whales were almost entirely out of the reach of human whalers because they were so fast until we threw diesel engines at them. Right? The other is to bunch together in mutual defense, and that's what killer whales did. That's what orcas did. And so that's a horrible defense against humans. That's like the worst possible thing that you can do. Right? You go flukes out, you bunch together, and then the whalers go around, they kill everyone. Right? And so the key insight, the key adaptation was basically sperm whales acting like baleen whales, like fleeing as soon as the approach of a ship, which entailed certain costs. There were reasons to do it that way, but that's the kind of thing which maybe could be modeled, right, by especially there's a whole other gender component to this that I explore a little bit in the chapter, striking that these are mostly female societies being hunted by almost solely men, but there are, so sperm whale males do rove between various pods. They could transmit some strategies from one to the other. In other words, it's like, a ship comes, it's like, let's get out of here. And whales, they clearly do communicate in some way about changing directions. Now, Whitehead says that they're painfully democratic. It can take an hour for a sperm whale pod to decide to shift directions. I've seen it watching sperm whales. They're just sort of very slow turn. There seems to be no real leader. So it is coordination takes time, but it clearly is happening, right? So that's one way. But that the orca example shows that the cultural adaptation can proceed quickly too, right? And that seems to be an example, right? That this is now embedded in the cultural traits of this group of orcas. Some people have interpreted as an anti-capitalist protest. I'm not quite prepared to go there. I think it's a form of play, probably. Killer whales are disposed around the world to play.
I've been on a boat where an orca was bumping against
Yeah.
a boat for fun.
Yeah.
Luckily not so horribly that it was scary, but it was like, whoa, this is a...
And they like to play with their prey too,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah.
Could I reflect back to a few themes and things I've noticed here?
Sure.
Especially at the end there, I thought it was great how you kind of landed on this adaptability to kind of social possibilities and threats in the 19th century, particularly as it concerns, this Pacific maritime sphere and diasporic communities, variously conceived. I wonder also, and I don't know if you do this in the other book or whether it's in this chapter, but thinking about the conjunction of human and whale communities centered on this idea of prey. And it occurred to me that maybe there's two facets that it might be possible to look at this. In a sense, the humans on the ship, as you mentioned with these ideas about bodily torture and whippings and everything like that, I mean, to what degree were the humans, in a sense, like prey to labor under capital as it was conceived with these, increasing scale of the whaling communities? Like, in a sense, why does whaling increase in its scale and scope during the 19th century? Is that driven by, 19th century capitalism? That's my question. And then that's the human side. And then on the whaling side, how was the prey conceived within 19th century value systems? You mentioned in the beginning, it's not just like hunting. I gather that it's kind of like different in the sense than, say, the hunting buffalo on the American plains, where it's some of it's within kind of economies where the buffalo are valued, and some of it's just like purely shooting for sport, like off of trains. But I assume the whales, it's really not just like a sporting activity. It's really that it's an attempt to recover oil and whalebone. And are those, because those things are being valued and also entering 19th century commodity markets. So prey on two sides there, thinking about values, commodity, capital, and labor. Is that where you kind of think this chapter might go, or that's touched on somewhere else in the book, or? thinking about prey as a centering concept there.
Yeah, I do think about prey as a important concept here, though I tend to see it as more complex, as likely you do too, John. But no doubt, people like John Bull were, in some sense, on the prey is the right word, because their bodies were valued alive in a way that sperm whale bodies were not. Right? They needed John Bull's labor. They needed him to be somewhat healthy and active. In fact, his body was in its particular attributes, especially of swimming, but also just muscle power, were really important here. And I could think through that with whales too. I guess a big sperm whale mother bull was much more valuable than a baby. So maybe there is some value embodied in its labor as well, in some way. But I tend to think of it. So bull's definitely a victim in some ways of a kind of large-scale capitalist transformation of the Pacific Ocean, right? But I don't see it so much on the whale ship. I see it as really on the land, in agreement with Rosenthal's here. Okay, he's really pushed off. He would have lived a very different life 100 years earlier, right? Would it have been better? Would it have been worse? I'm not sure. Would have been very different. He would have been a tenant farmer with at least ancestral claims to a certain part of the Hawaiian land, right? Now he would have owed military service probably, and some part of his harvest to the konahiki, the landlord basically there in Hawaii. That option was essentially foreclosed to him in the 1840s, and the whale ship offered a chance. I mean, look, his life, I think, inarguably turned out he was much wealthier, probably happier. Maybe he bore some scars, no question about it, if this was the same John Bull. But unquestionably, global capitalism offered him some opportunities here that he would not have had without whaling, basically. But he was also forced into because of capital. I mean, I don't know how to drop the balance sheet, but I think prey doesn't quite capture it. And in terms of whales, one of the persistent questions, and Lisa's very familiar with this, is the really ambivalent relationship which humans had towards whales in the 19th century. I see, of course, the kind of global transformation, or at least Western transformation of attitudes towards whales starting in the 1960s is remarkable. Right? In other words, like, let's kill them all. No, let's save them all. Like, that's pretty remarkable. On the other hand, I see it as an almost eternal kind of conflict within whales. There's always the ideas which we carry, which we think about, which we take into our relationship with whales today, which, by the way, the Japanese are very critical of, actually have a really deep history, and they were always present. And many people were really, really ambivalent about the history of whaling. So that's not to say the whales weren't prey; they clearly were.